first question is, what brought you to your respective programs? There's no order either.
I could start. So I transferred to UCLA as an undergrad from San Diego City College, and I transferred. My major was anthropology when I first got here, and at my community college we didn't have American Indian Studies. So when I found out we had it here, I started taking classes, and then I minored in it, and then I found out they had a master's program, so I applied to it, and yeah, that's how I found it.
How did I get to Black Studies? Yes, through trauma in a way. I went to Boise State for a little bit as an undergrad, right out of high school. Boise is very, very white, and it was very, very uncomfortable. And I couldn't really understand my experience out there until, so that's kind of when Black Lives Matter kind of started too. And it was a perfect time because that's kind of just how I felt. Like I felt, it kind of fueled my paranoia in a way. I just felt unprotected, very vulnerable out there by myself. There were no other Black people, but also just no other like people of color in general to kind of find some like camaraderie. So it was just lonely. Then I transferred back to Nevada. So I'm from Las Vegas. Went to Nevada, University of Nevada, Reno, which is still a very white place, but I saw way more Black and brown faces, and I felt more comfortable because that's what I grew up seeing. And even though I was a journalism major, but I covered just Black political events. And then my teacher said something that really stuck with me. She said, journalists cover the story, activists are the story. And I always felt like, even though I was like covering the story, I felt like I was into it. So pretty much that's where I went over to political science because we didn't have any ethnic studies or anything. But I identified that they had the most, like, I guess, classes where I could interrogate race. And then I was a McNair scholar, so I got to do my own research into race. And I knew that if I was gonna continue school, I needed to be in an interdisciplinary program because my research used critical race theory. I kind of taught myself critical race theory, and I use a lot at UCLA, just to understand experiences. I talked to people about how they understood race because I was trying to understand how I understood race. And I felt like I could do work like that, or just like think about life in my own terms and still understand my experience and the experience of others through a program like this. So I looked at ethnic studies, American studies, and African American studies, Black studies programs, and UCLA was a great fit, yeah. So here I
am. For me, so in undergrad I studied human biology, which was first motivated by wanting to go to med school, but then I got involved with student organizing, specifically like Asian American organizing in the Bay Area. And so through that experience, I learned about, what did it mean to be racialized? What did it mean to interrogate these identities that we associate ourselves with? And I learned that I wasn't happy with medicine in the sense of like, I would like see a patient and just treat them one-on-one and then send them right back out into this toxic environment. And so I found public health through that, which is why I ended up applying to Masters of Public Health programs. But I knew that wasn't enough because public health as a field is still very white and missing a lot of like theory and knowledge about how do we create solutions that are fit for communities of color, which is why I also chose to do a dual in Asian American Studies to really integrate the two and learn how to, practice health or create health interventions in a culturally, contextually relevant way, but also interrogate the various systems that we use to design these programs. And for me, Asian American Studies isn't just like learning more about my own community. It's a way of thinking that has really expanded the way I like see the world and the way we think about what a future could look like in terms of shared liberation for people of color, queer folks, you name it. And so I think having that radical envisioning from ethnic studies has really informed the way I practice public health and to push the field in more radical ways. So I feel like everyone should take ethnic studies classes for that, to really, learn what does it look like to build a new future.
That was great.
Just to let y'all know, we have 6 people watching.
Wow.
Y'all internationally known in the face.
So the question is, how did we end up in? So I'm in Chicano Studies, the PhD program. It's an MA PhD program, so we get our MA en route. So the first 2 years we're working on our MA, and then it's like we still go through that trajectory. What got me here? Well, I'm also a transfer student. I went to ELAC, where Tiffany also went. And I actually transferred here with an art history major. At the time, I really wanted to be a curator. I wanted to work at museums. So I was excited to be in the art history department here because it's pretty well known. But shortly did I realize that it was really white. We were still learning, a lot of like the curriculum in order to graduate was still taking a lot of these like Western European white classes. And even like the ethnic classes or like African art or Latin American art was like still taught by like white people. So it was just really uncomfortable and really unsettling. And at the time I was also taking classes in Chicano studies. And I was wanting to get involved with research, so I did McNair, and in thinking about my project, I knew that art history wasn't going to support the work that I wanted to do, because I was already kind of looking at a more interdisciplinary route anyways. So I dropped art history as a major. I picked up Chicano studies, and it was great. I got a lot of support from the faculty for my project and everything, and from there I knew that, McNair also kind of like puts you in that route to apply to graduate school, especially PhD programs. So I applied to 4 PhD programs, and they were different. So Chicano studies, sociology, and ethnic studies at UC Riverside. I got into this one. UCLA was the only place I got into. But I knew wherever I ended up, I wanted it to be an interdisciplinary ethnic studies type of program. But yeah, that's why I ended up here.
So the next question is, how does funding work in your program?
I can go first. So at least for the MA in Asian American Studies, the department really tries their best to fully fund the first year of everyone's study. And so for me, that came in the form of the Graduate Opportunity Fellowship, which is through the UCLA Grad Division. It fully covers tuition, and then it gives you a pretty nice stipend on top of it. But otherwise, most students in my department, after the first year, we fund ourselves by being TAs for classes. So I've been a TA for the past year and a half, and that pays for tuition and living costs.
Yeah, our program is pretty similar. So the fellowship covers the first year, and but you have to apply for it, which one of our cohort members didn't know. So she didn't apply for it, and she had to take out loans the first year. So I highly recommend. It's just like a paragraph that you have to.
Yeah, it's a diversity statement.
And then our second year is same thing, TA-ships, but our spring quarter is not covered. So I'm kind of freaking out now because I graduate next quarter, and I'm like, what am I going to do in the spring? So I don't know, but yeah, similar to Asian Am.
Yeah, so for PhDs, rule of thumb that I was always told is that you should never fund your own PhD program, that it should always be funded. So for me, I got 4 years funding. So I also got the Cota Robles fellowship, which is a UC-wide fellowship that you get. You have to be nominated actually from your department, and it requires a diversity statement as well. So in your application, you have to fill that out. Your department kind of nominates you, and if you get it, great. So it's 4 years. So the first year I'm on fellowship. year 2 and year 3, I'm TAing, and year 4 is where the fellowship kicks in again. And the duration of my program is 6 to 7 years. So after year 4, right now actually I'm still in the process of applying to summer funding and academic year funding, where I get to like move my TA ships or choose to be on fellowship. So it really varies when you're in PhD programs. I would imagine in MA programs too, maybe. But everybody's funding package looks completely different, especially because there's a lot of opportunities. There's Ford, UCLA has the GRM, which is the Graduate Research Mentorship Program, summer funding. So from year 1 to actually your whole time here, like you can be applying to those things to help cover year 5 and year 6. Yeah.
So yeah, Tristan had to leave today. So it'll be the 3 of you for the rest of the panel. The next question is, what was the application process like for your programs, and how did it differ from any other programs that you applied to?
So for my program, the main difference is we don't need the GRE. So usually you need to submit your GRE, but besides that it was similar. I think you needed 3 letters of rec, writing sample, a diversity statement, and I'm probably forgetting something else, but no GRE.
Yeah, Asian-Am is pretty much the same. There's no GRE requirement, but for public health, there is a GRE requirement. And so I remember the score lasts for 5 years, so I took mine, I think, a year before I applied. Yeah, but not much different.
Yeah, for mine, you did need the GRE, but the nice part about it was that my department was like, you just need to take it as a formality because graduate division needs it, but we're not going to look at your score. So like you can pretty much fail the GRE and you'll be fine, which is great because I failed the GRE. And so we needed the GRE score, we need a personal statement, a statement of purpose, a writing sample, and a diversity statement, and 3 letters of recs, up to 4. So it is a lot, and I think when you're applying to different PhD programs and different disciplines, it can be very time consuming. Like when I first started, I wanted to apply to 6, which was like sociology, American studies, ethnic studies, Chicano studies. But when you actually do it, it's not like undergrad where you're like, okay, 1 for all, right? Like this one, you really do have to like tailor your language, tailor your statement into like whatever department you're kind of going into. So it does take a lot of time, especially like if you're applying straight from undergrad because you're still doing undergrad work. So it is really time consuming. Even being in McNair, like I still felt like it was an isolating process because it is tough and it also gets really expensive. So I was really lucky that I was able to get those fees waived, but an application costs like what, $70, $90, up to $90?
Like 100 now.
Yeah, and then you have to like pay for your GRE scores if you don't have them sent right away from when you take them. So it's a lot. The application process is definitely isolating, and it's tough too when you're applying like with your friends and like you apply to similar programs and then you're kind of like waiting and then you're like who got in, who didn't. That's a lot. It's a lot of emotions. It's really tough, but not impossible.
Yeah. Nice fact is UCLA graduate division no longer requires a GRE. So now it's just starting this year. So now it's just departmental.
That's nice.
Yeah. I know. So we tell our students that because we're like, it's just per department. So if they want it, then you just have to take it. But it's not a graduate division role anymore. So that's nice. Yeah, I know. It
That's
sucks.
great.
Yeah, I know.
I know sometimes that deters people from applying to PhD.
Definitely. Yeah, because no one wants to take it actually. So, yeah.
It's
So
expensive too.
it is. So next question is, what do you appreciate most about your program? And you know, if you could see some changes, what would you like to see?
That's a great question. I can start. I think one thing that I really like about my program is majority of us are POC, and there's a lot of us that are first gen and even transfer students, which is really kind of unheard of in other PhD programs. So I'm really lucky. We're kind of like in a bubble. I feel like we're really spoiled because it's like non-competitive as well. Like we're not all BFFs, but we're also like not trying to like, do each other wrong either. So it's like really supportive in the sense where like if you're applying to something that someone else did a year ago, like we're really open to sharing each other's resources. We're really open to like our experiences, like, if you burned a bridge with the faculty, like, what did you do and what do we not do? How could we learn from like what you experienced? So I really like that. There's like a lot of community, and I'm really grateful for that. So that's one thing. Something that I would change. I think that's tough because, it's in academia, and I feel like as much as we want it to be more supportive or more in whatever we want, like it's kind of difficult. But I think definitely like more women faculty, or at least like more shared labor, because it really does fall on the same people, and they do have like a lot of students and they're overworked. So that kind of gets tough too, because if you need help, they have like all these other students that they're advising, so it gets tough in that sense. So if anything, more acknowledged labor within the department.
I think for my program, I really appreciate the cohort I'm in, but I can't say every cohort is the same, and I think that's just like not anyone's choosing, it's just what happens. But in Asian American Studies, it's a pretty small program. Usually cohorts are like 5 to 10 people, whereas in public health, it's much larger. And so with Asian Am, since it's smaller, I feel like I can really get to know other people better. And since academia is such a toxic, I don't know, just wears you down kind of environment, it's really nice to have that support group who like really goes through things with you. But I have to say, like the staff in Asian American Studies and the faculty are really supportive of their students, huge advocates. But I think one thing I changed in the program is, since I am at this like intersection between public health and ethnic studies, recently a lot of our faculty who have like training in mixed methods or quantitative methods have left, and so we have a lot of cultural studies scholars, which is fine. That's great, but I'd love to see like a diversity in how people are trained as faculty. And so, because I feel like there's so many students now who want to do these projects but don't have the right mentorship available to them. And so like in future hires, I think we can do a better job at that.
What do I appreciate the most out of my program? So out of all the UCs, UCLA is the only UC that has a MA in American Indian Studies. So I really appreciate that, and we have the most Native professors out of all the UCs. And since my research focuses on California Indians, like I never intended on like leaving California. So for me, it was like a win-win, and it's close to home. What changes? So we're not a department, we're interdepartmental, which is a blessing and a curse, or what is it? What's that saying? Like, yeah, right? Because then you can work with professors outside of your department, so anywhere in the school. But also that means that your professors they're not from American Indian Studies, so their priority is going to be gender studies or anthropology or another department. And then funding sucks because we're not our own department, and it just seems like all that trickles down to the students, and we feel it. We feel that our professors are everywhere and they're not really there for us. And I know right now we're currently like undergoing departmentalization.
Oh.
So, but that takes like 5 years, so we won't see it, but the future MA students will.
So the next question is, how do you see yourself applying your degree outside of academia?
I'll start. So I really want to work in tribal government, and that's one of the main reasons why I chose this MA program. But also, I'm interested in NAGPRA and repatriation and museum work and decolonizing the museum space. So it was either museums or tribal government. And so It just sucks that there aren't that many jobs right now in the museum space, especially in San Diego. But those are the two fields that I see myself going into, or at least applying to jobs.
I think if I didn't choose to go into academia, I would definitely be working like in the nonprofit space or at like the county department of public health, bringing in these ethnic studies frameworks. And so for me, like a big part of why I'm in grad school is to gain the skills that I need to go and create solutions with the communities that I want to work with. Like how do we design health interventions in tandem with what people really need and want. And so great public health is great because you can do that in academia, but you can also do it like at a think tank or county department of public health or a nonprofit. Like all of those things, they all work together. And so I feel like it's a blessing in that sense.
Yeah, for me, at least right now, I kind of see myself going into academia, whether that be community college, a teaching institution like a Cal State, or a research one. I just don't know yet, but you know, I love teaching. I also love writing and research. So I definitely see myself applying my degree to either one of those kind of sectors.
Thank you. So this is our last question before we open it up. If any of the viewers have questions, they can comment.
Y'all have any questions? Post them up.
So the last question from me is, what do you plan on pursuing after you finish your respective graduate programs? I know this is kind of a repeat, but yeah.
I mean, ideally, like my dream job would probably be running the Chicano Studies department at UAC and having a 10-year job position.
Do it.
Yes. I think for me, the dream job is to be a tenure track professor. And the person who created the dual Asian NAM public health program, she was a joint professor in like both departments, and so that really is like the dream job for me, to be able to do work in both departments and come back to UCLA and do that.
And for me, it would be being a curator at a museum back home that works primarily with NAGPRA and repatriation.
I have a question. It's not really about the panel, it's about if I could borrow the laptop like that.
Oh.
I'm not gonna charge you this
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it won't be public.
I actually
No,
have
like.
I
oh,
have
you-
a thing too.
Oh yeah, that'd be awesome.
What's next?
But I do have some
I'm
questions
sorry,
about.
it's a law, so the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. Graves, yeah,
Okay.
so it states that any, like, institution that receives federal funding, so UCLA or a museum that has Native American skeletons or human remains or like sacred objects needs to return them back to the tribes. So this law passed in 1990, but a lot of institutions, UC Berkeley, they haven't been compliant, and so it's always like in the news, and there's some schools like UC San Diego doesn't want to return certain human remains back to the tribes, and so they have to go to court. But UCLA is really compliant. Last year, in 2016, we returned over 2,000 ancestors to local tribes.
Wow.
So that's why that's one of the reasons why I love UCLA, and I work at the Fowler too. So
Okay.
that's what.
I didn't even know we had that law.
Yeah, I should have explained that. I'm sorry.
No.
Thank you for asking. He's like, what's NAGPRA?
I heard that anthropology used to like hold some remains.
In Haynes.
Yeah,
They
that's
used to
what
be
I-
like in the basement.
Yeah, not anymore, right?
Mm-mm.
Oh,
They're
that's
all
good.
Okay, I have some questions.
Yes.
So, I have some questions in terms of how did you, what was your first introduction to ethnic study courses, or maybe not necessarily ethnic studies, but in terms of, you know, like ethnic study courses or just learning a little bit more about your culture. Some of us are exposed to it maybe at birth, some of us are exposed to it later, but when was that, if I could ask?
That's a great question. I think growing up in East LA, like it was everywhere, you know, with murals and everything. But I just didn't have like that critical lens or like language to really like articulate like, you know, racial discrimination or like redlining or like all those things that we learn in college, right, or in higher ed. So I think my first like type of exposure to that was at ELAC at my community college, taking my first Chicano studies courses. I got exposed to a lot of Chicano literature. That's where I first learned about Gloria Zaldúa and everybody that you really read about in the discipline. So yeah, community college.
Yeah, I grew up in the Inland Empire, so like Fontana, Riverside area, and I was like one of a few Vietnamese kids there, and so I was like pretty like, racialized into just general Asian American, but I didn't really think too deeply about that in high school until my first year of college. We had these alternative spring break trips where instead of going home for spring break, you go on a public service trip and visit nonprofits or whatever about a certain issue. And so out of all the trips that were offered that year, there was one about Asian American issues, and I only applied to it because it was the only question that I like felt excited to answer. And they asked about like, you know, when do you feel like your identity really stood out for you? And so it was through that trip where we also had to take a course before going on the trip, where I started to think a lot more deeply about what is race, what is ethnicity, what does it mean to be an immigrant or a child of immigrants or refugees in my case. And then being able to like trace my individual and family story to like larger historical events was like mind-blowing. And I was like, whoa, there's so much out there, and there's like all these other people experiencing like discrimination, wage theft, mental health issues related to like trauma and war. And I'd never had that experience before, and I think that like sent me down this black hole that we call ethnic studies. Yeah.
So I grew up in Eagle Rock, which is like Northeast LA. And then in high school, my family, and so I had no exposure to ethnic studies or whatever, and it's not East LA or South Central, it's Northeast LA. It's very, I would say, I don't know, suburban and you know, so, but in high school, my family moved to San Diego, and then from San Diego, my dad lost his job, and just economic issues, we had to move to Mexico because it's like close, we moved to Tecate, a border town of San Diego. So we crossed the border every day for me to go to high school in San Diego. And that's when I started to make all these connections, and I started to realize, like, you know, see the differences in Mexico and see the differences in San Diego and where my friends were from in San Diego, which is Barrio Logan. And so one of my cousins who was older, she told me like, oh, and at this time I was going through issues, and I dropped out of high school, and I was like, you know, running away, taking the Greyhound to LA and partying with my friends. And my cousin just told me like, you know, you should take a Chicano studies class. You should learn about your history. And I didn't know what that was. And I was like, yeah, whatever. And my parents were like, well, you either need to go to school or start working. Like, you can't just live here and not do anything. So I was like, okay, I'll go to community college. And then I enrolled in Chicano studies, and that like blew my mind because I didn't know that. And it was very, like what you were saying, like very empowering to know your history, to see yourself, you know, in your professors, that representation, and learn your history. And then from Chicano studies, I just took so many classes, and I had no intention on transferring or whatever. I was just killing time. And I finally did transfer, and then I went into American Indian Studies, which is similar, very similar to Chicano studies, kind of different, but has a lot of similarities overlapping. So, yeah.
I have a second question. So our majors, all of our majors, right, are kind of spread out in a sense, right? They're spread out, right? Like each program or each department is with their own, right? But every now and then there is collaborations, which is very important, right? As third world people, as you know, people of color. But what would you say would be the next steps to bring that even closer? Because we feel that, right? That our programs are kind of separate, but you know, at the end of the day, this was all fought together, right? Like the Ethnic Third World Liberation Front was a united front of different groups, but as decades have passed, we have been kind of separating each other and kind of like, well, that's Chicano studies and that's American Indian studies, and every now and then, right? Like maybe we might have a class, but what goes beyond just collaborating on an event or in a class together, right? To really bring together, you know, all third world people and you know, demand liberation, fight for liberation, and ethnic studies, you know, the new generation of ethnic studies for the next 50 years, right? Because we just hit our 50-year gap. What do you think would be those?
That's a big question.
I can start with, okay, so my program is American Indian Studies, and there's this big divide right now with American Indian Studies and Indigenous Studies. Like, there's a lot of old school people in our program, professors, and then even students that feel a certain way that we're American Indian Studies and we should only be focusing within the borders of the United States. And then on top of that, federally recognized tribes. So not even the Tongva or other tribes that are not federally recognized. And that's the very like old school thinking. But then there's that Indigenous Studies and that's what we're going in, because our chair, she works in Mexico, and then the director of the center, she's Indigenous from Canada. Her tribe's on both sides of the border, so like we're starting to be more global. But I don't know, because we have that I guess issue a lot with our AGSA and ASA, and sometimes ASA doesn't want to work across, you know, campus with other organizations because they're like, well, we're not Mexican, so we're not gonna work with MECHA. And I just see our department, unfortunately, is more separatist because of the difference. Just like American Indians, I don't know how to explain this. So my friend explained it this way: the difference between American Indians and other, you know, people of color is like they don't want to be a part of American society. They want their own separate. They have sovereignty, you know. So there's that difference between American Indian Studies and the other departments, which is that sovereignty that they inherently have as tribes. And so I think it's tricky with American Indian Studies, and we've tried with AGSA to have events across campus, and there's pushback from people in our department, specifically students, tribal Indian students. So I don't know, and I'm Mexican, so I sometimes feel like, okay, it's not my place to tell these students or our organization how it should, you know what I mean? I don't know. So, sorry.
No, thank you. That's a real answer right there.
I think that's really real. You know, I think each of our departments have our own internal drama, and in really trying to sort that out, like, it's like, who is this labor falling on, and like who's doing the work to like really try to connect these bridges, right? So it can be really tough. And I think even with Chicano studies, like there's a lot of push to change the name to Latino studies, where a lot of people are like, well, we have to move past it, right? Or like people don't necessarily identify as Chicana, Chicano, Chicanao, Chicanx, right? So it gets even really complicated because like we have these debates and these discussions. So it's tough, you know, like I don't know, I guess maybe like it's us as students that need to do this work. I mean, it is us that have to do it, but in even trying to organize as like a graduate student, like, because we have like roles, we have like a grad student council and stuff, but like as someone who helped form that, like it's so labor intensive, you know, and it's only like 2-3 people out of the whole program that do this work. So like, and even trying to like cross collaborate with other departments, like I'm for it, but it's like, 1, people might not care. 2, people are either against it and they're like, why am I going to do that? Like, I don't care about this. I'm just here because it's an interdisciplinary program. You know, there's people that really don't care about the legacy of the Chicano movement, unfortunately. And 3, like, again, it just falls on the labor of people, you know, certain people, the same people, mostly women. So it's tough, you know, and I think that's an important question and something that I constantly ask myself, not in the context of like ethnic studies or like doing more cross-cultural like solidarity work, but just in general like student organizing, I think it's really tough. But that's not to shut it down. I think it's like, yeah, we need to have these conversations. These questions need to be, raised. Also, where do the faculty play into this too, right? Because we also have people that are like in AFM and Chicano studies. We have people that are like, kind of like, cross-listed with different departments, right? So it's also like having faculty to like help us out with these things too, So it gets tricky. But thank you for asking that question, because I think it's an important one. And as people who do this discipline and are passionate about it, like it is our responsibility and our job to like carry on this conversation, but also like type of idea or movement.
Yeah, and I think it's why we have like this umbrella Institute of American Cultures, which does oversee like the 4 ethnic studies and indigenous studies centers. But I think it's one thing to think of ethnic studies departments as an avenue for shared liberation. I think academia can only play one role in that movement. I think there are so many great, and I cannot think of specific ones right now, but like great activist movements out there outside of academia that are showing what it looks like to have real collaboration, solidarity amongst different groups of people. And so I think it's possible. I just don't know if looking towards academia for that is like the best. Yes, the Third World Liberation Front started at SF State, but I think now these departments have become so professionalized and subsumed into the ivory tower. It's like, one, hard to yank them out of that, and that's probably, our role as students to continue to push our faculty and departments to like go back to their radical roots. But 3, it's like asking a lot for students who still have to survive in this type of environment. And so I feel like it's good to be in academia, but it's also good to distance ourselves and see what else is happening out there outside of this bubble. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Great question, though.
I have one more. So recently, California was moving towards making ethnic studies a graduation requirement for all high school students, and it was vetoed by Governor Jerry Brown. Currently, there is a new assembly bill being pushed by Medina, AB 131, 131 or 133, and it's just making its way up. What role do universities play in this movement of getting ethnic studies across the high school curriculum and, making it bigger? Because if we get it in the high schools, then, for example, many of you shared that it wasn't until your community college, it wasn't until something outside of academia, right, where you were introduced to ethnic studies. But what if it was introduced in middle school and high school, right? Where would the future of ethnic studies be, right, when this movement does happen and we begin having these conversations, these courses really young? What role does UCs and higher, because they see it as separate. Oh, that's K through 12. That's K through 12 ethnic studies. And we're like over here, we're at the UCs or we're at our institutions, our ones. What role do you, and not just you, but also, other departments play in this movement? Because it's a movement again, right, for ethnic studies. 50 years from now, right? What happened since then?
I mean, I'm definitely for it. I think to think about all the youth that would have access to an ethnic studies class and a space to talk about their identities and really reflect on that. Like if I had that in middle school, I would be a much different person now. Probably a more confident person. And I feel like because a lot of the UCs do have ethnic studies classes, I mean, UCLA has the diversity requirement. Like these could be models for building curriculum at the high school level. And a lot of us have TA'd as well, and we know what work it takes to create a space in the classroom that can cater to a wide variety of students. I regularly have tons of STEM students in my classes, and teaching ethnic studies to a bunch of STEM students is a very challenging task. And I think that's what you're gonna get when you make ethnic studies a requirement in K through 12, is you're gonna get students who don't wanna do it, and they're just gonna do it because it's mandatory. But I think drawing on the experiences of graduate students, of faculty who have really gone through that, would only make that movement a lot stronger.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that was a really great point. It is tough, and I do think the university needs to play a role, and it's unfortunate how it's always so separate. Like middle schools or K through 12 is one thing, the CC is a separate thing. You know, when in reality, like it's curriculum, right? It's ethnic studies. Like it is very important. You know, but in thinking about what that would look like in K through 12, you know, I think, yeah, kind of going back to your question, like how do you teach it to folks that haven't been exposed to this? So I think about like pedagogy and everything, and like how that would look like. But I think it's important. You know, and I'm for it. And if there's any way I can support, like I will, because I mean, as educators or people that want to like educate in ethnic studies, like it involves us, right? So it's an important conversation to be a part of, for sure.
Yeah. I don't know what role the UC would play, you know, like to answer your question, but I do think it is super important. And yeah, like it is a travesty that most of us, we take ethnic studies in community college, and I would be totally different if I took those classes when I was younger. And not just benefit, you know, students of color, but it would also benefit white kids, you know? And so it would be beneficial for everyone across the board. I don't know what the process is of like, you know, getting laws passed. So now is it gonna be up to Newsom or like to sign it off, which I'm sure, I don't know, like, do you have to lobby or like, do you need to, I don't know like how that works, but hopefully he seems a little bit more radical than Brown. Maybe he will sign it, I don't know.
Yeah, and we already have examples like Cal State Long Beach has a program where they've hired, like someone in our Asian American Studies program has been hired as a lecturer at Cal State Long Beach, but she's teaching ethnic studies classes to high schoolers at Long Beach Poly. I could see the UC's doing something similar.
LAUSD
Yes,
passed it, right?
Yeah.
A
Ethnic
while
studies.
back, yeah.
Shout out to Ethnic Studies Now. Right. And final question is, where do you see ethnic studies 50 years from now? Because we just hit our 50-year anniversary since the Third World Liberation Front, since the Plan de Santa Barbara, since all those different movements that happened, right? 50 years from now, like, you know, let's look at 2069, right, or whatever, or whatever. Because y'all are scholars, you're gonna pave the way to that 50 years, right? Like, what do you see ethnic studies or just your individual discipline being 50 years from now?
So for my program, American Indian Studies, like and we see it now, but I see individual tribes having their own programs, their own studies. So in San Diego, we have Kumeyaay studies. The Maori in New Zealand have Maori studies. In Hawaii, there's the Hawaiian School of Knowledge. So I see it being less broad and being more individual for the specific tribes, the nations, which in the United States of America, there's over 400. So either through tribal colleges or whatever, like in San Diego, we have the Kumeyaay Community College. So that's what I see. Hopefully every tribe, every nation would have their own curriculum.
I think for Asian American Studies, there's a lot of groundbreaking work right now. And I think in relation to American Indian and Indigenous Studies, a lot of work, like Tiffany does some of this too, in settler colonialism, like thinking about Asian Americans as settlers in America, as complicit in, displacement, actually, yeah, thank you. So how do we, as Asian American Studies scholars and activists, reevaluate our position in the U.S. and how do we align ourselves with, Indigenous peoples to aid them in the fight for sovereignty, but also how do we think about Asian American studies beyond just Asian America in a transnational context, especially in an era of globalization. So I think ethnic studies now is taking that turn across all of our fields to a more transnational look, because racial capitalism is such a multifaceted beast. It works on such a mass scale that we can't just look at U.S. context anymore. That's not enough. So I feel like in the next 50 years we're going to see a lot more transnational work.
Yeah, very similar to like what they said. Hopefully more educators, right? There's more people getting into grad school, more people getting into higher ed. So hopefully more folks that are like willing to do this work and carry it on. But also more like specific centralized group, type of like studies, right? Like Central American studies, Afro-Latino studies, right? Like hopefully seeing more of that initiative, right? So like really stemming out of like this umbrella term, right, of ethnic studies, which is important, right? But I think it's also important to recognize how each of these groups have their own individual histories and experiences that overlap a lot of the time, but are also very significant on their own. So hopefully seeing more of that, a lot of transnational global work as well too, that's important. And again, I think just more educators, more people.
Dope.
You just stepped in, so I was wondering, we have like set questions, right? And so right now it's just Q&A. Feel free to introduce yourself to the group, and maybe if you have any questions that you wanted to address during this time.
I don't have any specific questions. I'm Kim's friend. My name is Lauren.
Oh.
I'm a grad student.
Welcome.
All right, so I gotta go.
Okay.
'Cause I have. But this is straight from the Graduate Mentor Research Program, right? GMRP, UCLA, right? It's my institution. These are awesome grad students, right? They're paving the way in terms of ethnic studies. Thank you so much for this opportunity. Ahora en español, damas y caballeros, niños y niñas, este programa es patrocinado por el GMRP, UCLA. Es un programa que ayuda a nuestras comunidades llegar a posiciones de doctorados o maestrías o lo que sea. Si están interesados más, por favor me pueden comunicar, pero este es un panel sobre de los estudios étnicos y indígenas que quieren ir que están en sus programas de maestría o de doctorados. So, todos estos son el futuro de nuestra educación, estudios étnicos y indígenas. Saludos desde aquí de Westwood, de Los Ángeles. Abrazo, thank you everybody. Peace and power. My name is Alejandro, reporting live.